The morning Rebecca Brandt woke with scarlet fever blisters covering her face and neck. She knew her life in Quartzsite, Arizona, was over. It was January of 1882, and the winter had brought an unusual cold snap to the desert town, with temperatures dropping low enough that ice formed on the water troughs, and a dusting of snow had fallen the night before. The fever had ravaged her body for 3 weeks, and though she had survived when so many others hadn't, the disease had left its mark on her in ways that made the townspeople whisper and turn away. The blisters had scarred, leaving her skin mottled and rough, her once smooth complexion now a patchwork of discolored flesh that made children cry and adults avert their eyes. Her stepmother, Martha, stood in the doorway of the small room where Rebecca had been quarantined, her face a mask of disgust, poorly concealed behind a handkerchief. "You cannot stay here," Martha said, her voice flat and final. "The customers at the boarding house are already complaining. They say you will bring disease, that you are cursed. Your father would understand if he were still alive." Rebecca pulled the thin blanket closer around her shoulders, though it did little to ward off the cold that seeped through the walls. "I have nowhere to go," she said, her voice still raspy from weeks of illness. "Please, Martha, I will work harder. I will stay out of sight." "You should have thought of that before you caught the fever," Martha replied, unmoved. "I have already spoken to Reverend Collins. He agrees that it is best for the community if you leave. There is a wagon heading north in an hour. You will be on it." The wagon took her 15 miles north into the higher elevations where the desert gave way to sparse forests of juniper and pinyon pine, and where the snow lay thicker on the ground. The driver, a grizzled man who refused to look at her directly, stopped the wagon near a cluster of rocks and pointed to a narrow trail. "There is an abandoned prospector's cabin about a mile that way," he said. "You will have shelter at least. That is more than most would give you." He did not wait for her response before turning the wagon around and heading back toward Quartzsite, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the snow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing a blanket, a tin cup, and half a loaf of stale bread that Martha had grudgingly provided. The wind cut through her worn dress, and she wrapped her arms around herself as she began walking up the trail, her boots crunching through the frozen crust of snow. The cabin was worse than she had imagined. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the dirt floor was littered with debris, and animal droppings suggested that creatures had made it their home long before she arrived. But it was shelter, and as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Rebecca knew she had no choice. She spent the remaining daylight hours trying to make the space habitable, using branches and her blanket to block the worst of the gaps in the walls, and clearing a small area where she could sleep. That first night, she huddled in the corner of the cabin, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling the cold seep into her bones. She thought of her father, dead now for 2 years, and how he had always told her she was beautiful, that her kind heart mattered more than anything else. He had not lived to see the fever transform her, to see the way people now looked at her with fear and revulsion. Perhaps that was a mercy. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of cold and hunger. The bread lasted only 2 days, and after that, Rebecca survived on snow melted in her tin cup, and the few pine nuts she managed to gather from the trees around the cabin. She grew weaker, her body still recovering from the fever and unable to cope with the lack of food and the bitter cold. On the 5th day, she stopped going outside, too exhausted to move. She lay on the dirt floor, wrapped in her thin blanket, and waited for the end to come. She did not hear the horse approach on the morning of the 6th day. She was drifting in and out of consciousness, her body shutting down from exposure and starvation. The sound of boots on the wooden step barely registered, and when the broken door creaked open, letting in a shaft of bright winter sunlight, she could not even turn her head to see who had found her. "Jesus Christ," a male voice said, low and urgent. Then there were hands on her shoulders, gentle but firm, and she felt herself being lifted. "Stay with me," the voice said. "I have got you. You are going to be all right." She wanted to tell him that it was too late, that she was too far gone, but her lips would not form the words. Instead, she let the darkness take her, feeling oddly safe in the stranger's arms as he carried her out into the cold morning air. When Rebecca woke, she was warm for the first time in days. She lay on a real bed with thick blankets piled on top of her, and the air smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. For a moment, she thought she had died and gone to heaven, but then her body reminded her that she was very much alive, every muscle aching and her throat burning with thirst. "You are awake," the same male voice said, and she turned her head to see a man sitting in a chair beside the bed. He was in his mid-20s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and gray eyes that studied her with concern rather than disgust. His face was tanned from long hours in the sun, and he wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, denim pants and a blue flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. "How do you feel?" "Thirsty," she managed to say, and he immediately stood and poured water from a pitcher into a cup. He helped her sit up, supporting her back with one arm while he held the cup to her lips with his other hand. "Slow," he said as she tried to gulp the water. "You will make yourself sick, just small sips." She obeyed, drinking slowly, and when the cup was empty, she sank back against the pillows, exhausted from even that small effort. "Where am I?" she asked. "My ranch," he said. "About 3 miles from where I found you. My name is Yates Thompson. I own a small cattle operation up here in the high country." "I am Rebecca," she said, then hesitated. "Rebecca Brandt. But you should not have brought me here. People say I am cursed, that I carry disease." Yates pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down again. "You had scarlet fever," he said matter-of-factly. "I can see the scars, but you are not contagious now. My mother survived scarlet fever when she was young. She had scars too. That does not make a person cursed." Rebecca felt tears sting her eyes, the first kindness she had experienced in weeks threatening to break through the wall she had built around her emotions. "Why did you come to that cabin? How did you find me?" "I ride through that area regularly, checking on my stock," Yates explained. "I noticed tracks in the snow leading to the cabin a few days ago, but I figured it was probably just a drifter passing through. Then yesterday, I saw smoke from your direction, or rather, I saw that there was no smoke, and that bothered me. If someone was in that cabin, they should have had a fire going in this cold, so I rode up this morning to check. Good thing I did." "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. "You saved my life." "You would have done the same for me," Yates said, though they both knew that was not necessarily true. Most people would have passed by, unwilling to help someone marked by disease. "Now, you need to eat something. I have broth on the stove. Your stomach is not ready for anything heavier yet." Over the following days, Yates nursed Rebecca back to health with a patience and gentleness that surprised her. He brought her broth and weak tea at first, then gradually introduced bread and eggs and finally meat. He changed the bandages on her frost-bitten fingers and toes, working carefully to prevent infection. And most importantly, he never once looked at her scarred face with anything other than simple acceptance. His ranch house was small but well built, with 2 bedrooms, a main room that served as both kitchen and living space, and a stone fireplace that kept the interior warm even when the wind howled outside. Through the window beside her bed, Rebecca could see the corrals where Yates kept his horses and the barn where he stored hay and equipment. Beyond that, the land rolled away in shades of brown and gray, dotted with juniper trees and occasional patches of snow in the shadows. On the fourth day after her rescue, Rebecca felt strong enough to get out of bed. Yates had left clean clothes for her, a simple brown dress that had belonged to his mother, and when she looked at herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall, she was shocked by what she saw. The weeks of illness and near starvation had left her gaunt, her cheeks hollow and her eyes too large in her thin face. And of course, there were the scars, the mottled patches of discolored skin that covered her face and neck, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to death. She found Yates in the barn, forking hay into the feed troughs for his horses. He looked up as she entered, and a smile crossed his face. "You should not be out of bed yet," he said, but there was no real reproach in his voice. "I have been lying down for nearly a month," Rebecca said. "I needed to move, to do something useful. Please let me help. You have done so much for me, and I have given you nothing in return." Yates set down the pitchfork and walked over to her. "You do not owe me anything," he said seriously. "I did not save you because I expected payment." "I know," Rebecca said, "but I want to help anyway. I am a hard worker, Mr. Thompson. Before the fever, I ran my father's boarding house almost single-handedly. I can cook, clean, mend, tend animals. I can earn my keep." Something shifted in Yates's expression, a flicker of respect and something else she could not quite identify. "All right," he said, "but only if you call me Yates. Mr. Thompson was my father, and he has been dead for 5 years now." They fell into a routine over the following weeks. Rebecca took over the cooking and the household chores, and gradually, as her strength returned, she began helping Yates with the outdoor work as well. She learned to feed the horses and chickens, to collect eggs, and to help with the endless tasks that came with running a ranch. The work was hard, especially in the cold January weather, but it felt good to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond simply surviving. Yates was different from any man Rebecca had known before. He was quiet and steady, never raising his voice or showing impatience even when things went wrong. He treated her as an equal, asking her opinion on decisions and listening to her ideas. And most remarkably, he seemed completely untroubled by her scarred appearance. He looked her directly in the eye when they spoke, never averting his gaze or focusing on some point beyond her shoulder the way most people did. One evening in early February, as they sat by the fireplace after supper, Rebecca finally gathered the courage to ask him about it. "Why does my face not bother you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone else can barely stand to look at me." Yates was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his words were careful and thoughtful. "My mother had scars from scarlet fever, like I told you, but there was more than that. When I was 12, there was an accident. A kerosene lamp broke and caught fire. My mother pulled me out of the flames, but she was badly burned. The right side of her face and her right arm were scarred for the rest of her life. Some people in town treated her differently after that, like she was less than she had been before. It made me angry because she was still the same person. She was still my mother, still kind and strong and brave. The scars did not change who she was inside." He turned to look at Rebecca then, his gray eyes intense. "When I look at you, I see someone who survived something terrible. I see someone who kept going even when the people who should have protected you turned their way. I see strength and courage. The scars are just part of your story, Rebecca. They do not define you." Rebecca felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, had ever looked past the surface to see the person beneath. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," she said softly. "She was," Yates agreed. "She died 3 years ago, pneumonia. My father never recovered from losing her. He followed her 6 months later. That is why I am out here alone trying to make this ranch work." "It must be lonely," Rebecca said. "It was," Yates said, and the look he gave her made her heart skip a beat. "But it is not anymore." The winter began to loosen its grip on the high country as February gave way to March. The snow melted except in the deepest shadows, and the first hints of green appeared on the hillsides. Rebecca's health continued to improve, and she found herself looking forward to each day with an anticipation she had never felt before. She and Yates worked side by side, their conversations growing longer and more personal as they learned each other's stories. She told him about her childhood, about her father who had been a carpenter before opening the boarding house, and about her mother who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Rebecca was 10. She told him about Martha, who had married her father for his money and had never shown Rebecca anything but cold indifference. And she told him about the fever, about the terror of lying in that quarantine room listening to people dying in the street outside, about the moment she had realized she would survive but would be forever changed. Yates listened to it all without judgment, and in turn, he shared his own history. He had grown up on this land, the son of homesteaders who had carved out a life in the harsh high desert. He had learned to ride before he could walk, had helped his father build the ranch house and barn with his own hands. He had dreamed once of seeing more of the world, of traveling east to the cities, but his parents' deaths had tied him to this place, and now he could not imagine living anywhere else. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked one morning as they rode out to check on the cattle that grazed in the valley below the ranch. "Staying here instead of following your dreams?" Yates considered the question, his hands easy on the reins of his bay gelding. Rebecca rode beside him on a gentle mare he had given her to use, and she had taken to horseback riding with surprising ease. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but dreams change as we grow older. What I wanted at 20 is not what I want at 26. This land is in my blood, Rebecca. It is hard and unforgiving, but it is also beautiful and honest. You know where you stand here. The land does not care about scars or mistakes or what people think you should be. It only cares about whether you are strong enough and smart enough to survive." "I think I understand that," Rebecca said. She did not add that she was beginning to feel the same way about this place, that the high desert with its stark beauty and harsh realities was becoming home in a way that Quartzsite never had. They spent the morning riding the fence line, repairing breaks and checking for signs of predators. Yates had about 100 head of cattle, a mix of longhorns and crosses that could survive on the sparse vegetation. It was not a large operation, but it was enough to provide a living, especially since Yates also broke and trained horses, selling them to ranchers and the army. As they worked, Rebecca found herself watching Yates, noticing the way he moved with confident grace, the way his hands were gentle with the animals but strong when needed. She noticed the small things, like how he always made sure she had the easier tasks, how he would point out interesting birds or plants as they rode, sharing his knowledge of this land he loved. And she noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, with an expression that made her pulse quicken and her face flush. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one evening as she stood at the window watching him work with a young horse in the corral. It terrified her, because love meant vulnerability, and she had been hurt so badly already. But it also filled her with a joy she had never known, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the fireplace behind her. The question was whether Yates felt the same way. He was kind to her, certainly, and he seemed to enjoy her company. But was that love, or simply the natural camaraderie that developed between two people living and working together in isolation? Her answer came on a warm evening in late March. They had finished the day's work early, and Yates suggested they ride up to a spot he wanted to show her. They climbed higher into the hills as the sun began to set, following a winding trail through juniper and pinyon, until they emerged onto a rocky outcrop that overlooked the entire valley. Below them, the land stretched away in layers of purple and gold, the last light painting the mountains in the distance with shades of pink and orange. "I used to come here with my parents when I was young," Yates said as they sat on the sun-warmed rocks. "My mother said this was where you could see the whole world." Rebecca looked out at the vast landscape, at the endless sky above, and the rugged beauty of the earth below. "It is magnificent," she breathed. "You are magnificent," Yates said, and when she turned to look at him in surprise, she found him watching her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something. These past 2 months, having you here, working beside you, talking with you, learning who you are, it has changed everything for me. I know we have not known each other long, but out here, time moves differently. You know a person by how they act when things are hard, by whether they complain or just do what needs doing. And you are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known." "Beautiful," Rebecca said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yates, I am scarred. I am marked." "How can you possibly call me beautiful?" He reached out and cupped her cheek with his hand, his touch gentle but sure. "You are beautiful to me," he said firmly. "Everything about you. Your courage, your kindness, your smile when you are pleased about something. The way you sing when you are cooking and think I cannot hear you. The way you are gentle with the animals but fierce when something needs protecting. And yes, your face is beautiful too. These scars are part of you, part of your story, part of what made you into the woman you are." How could I not find that beautiful? Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks, but for the first time in months they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I love you," she whispered. "I did not mean to. I tried not to, but I do." "Thank God," Yates said, and then he was kissing her, his lips warm and sure against hers. Rebecca kissed him back, pouring all of her hope and fear and love into that moment, and when they finally pulled apart, she knew that her life had irrevocably changed again, but this time for the better. "Marry me," Yates said, his forehead resting against hers. "I know it is fast. I know you might want more time, but Rebecca, I am sure. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Marry me and stay here with me. Help me build this ranch into something greater. Let me spend the rest of my life showing you every day how perfect you are to me." "Yes," Rebecca said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Quartzsite. Rebecca had been anxious about returning to the town that had cast her out, but Yates insisted that they had nothing to be ashamed of and everything to celebrate. He rode into town 2 days before the wedding and arranged everything with a quiet determination that brooked no argument. On the morning of the wedding, Rebecca dressed in a new gown that Yates had ordered from the dressmaker, a simple but elegant dress of ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for the first time since the fever, she saw not just the scars but the whole of herself, the woman she had become through suffering and survival, the woman that Yates loved. The ceremony was small, attended only by the Reverend, his wife who served as witness, and a few of Yates's friends from neighboring ranches. Martha did not come, which was no surprise, but Rebecca found she did not care. She had Yates, and that was enough. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Yates kissed her thoroughly, without embarrassment or hesitation, in front of everyone. And when they walked out of the church into the bright April sunshine, Rebecca saw some of the townspeople who had gathered to stare. She saw the shock on their faces. The disbelief that someone like Yates Thompson, a respected rancher with no blemishes on his record or his face, would choose to marry someone like her. Yates must have seen them too, because he stopped on the church steps and pulled Rebecca close, his arm around her waist. "This is my wife," he announced clearly, his voice carrying across the street. "Rebecca Thompson, and she is the finest woman I have ever known. If any of you have a problem with that, you can take it up with me." No one spoke. No one dared. And after a moment, Yates helped Rebecca into the wagon he had brought, and they drove out of Quartzsite together, heading north toward their home in the high country. The first months of their marriage were a time of discovery and deepening love. Rebecca learned the rhythms of Yates's body, the way he liked his coffee in the morning, and the way he sighed contentedly when he finally sat down after a long day's work. She learned that he had a scar on his left shoulder from where a horse had kicked him when he was 16, and that he sometimes had nightmares about the fire that had burned his mother. Yates learned that Rebecca was ticklish behind her knees, that she loved thunderstorms, and that she had a surprisingly bawdy sense of humor that emerged once she felt comfortable enough to let her guard down. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but fearless when facing down a protective mother cow, and that she cried every time they found a new calf in the spring pastures. They worked together to improve the ranch, building a new chicken coop and expanding the garden. Rebecca proved to have a gift with growing things, and soon they had vegetables that were the envy of the neighboring ranchers. She also took over the bookkeeping, discovering that she had a head for numbers and organization that Yates lacked. Under her management, they began to see more profit, which they put back into buying better breeding stock and improving the property. Life was not without its challenges. There were droughts that tested their water supplies, predators that took calves and chickens, and the endless hard work that came with ranching. But they faced everything together, and each challenge overcome only strengthened their bond. In October of that first year, Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Yates, and when she finally shared the news one evening after supper, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy, picked her up, and spun her around before remembering that she was expecting and setting her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Rebecca, we are going to be parents. Are you happy?" She asked, though she could already see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Yates said. He knelt down and placed his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I promise I am going to do everything I can to be a good one. And your mother, well, you could not ask for anyone better." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Yates became almost comically protective, insisting that Rebecca rest more and trying to prevent her from doing any of the heavier ranch work. Rebecca bore his concern with amused patience, though she continued doing most of her regular tasks until she became too unwieldy to move comfortably. In late May of 1883, during a warm spring night when the air smelled of sage and new grass, Rebecca went into labor. Yates had brought a midwife from a neighboring ranch to stay with them for the last few weeks of the pregnancy, a capable older woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered dozens of babies in her time. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon. Yates paced outside the bedroom, occasionally allowed in to hold Rebecca's hand and offer words of encouragement. Each cry of pain from her tore at him, making him feel helpless and afraid in a way that facing down wild horses or aggressive cattle never had. But finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a new sound filled the house, the lusty cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Chen emerged from the bedroom with a smile on her face. "You have a son," she announced. "A big, healthy boy with good lungs." Yates rushed into the bedroom to find Rebecca propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, scrunched-up face, and he was the most beautiful thing Yates had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" he asked, and Rebecca carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Yates looked down at his son, at this new life that he and Rebecca had created, and felt a love so fierce and overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked softly. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Yates knew exactly what name was right. "Samuel," he said, "after my father, Samuel James Thompson." "Samuel," Rebecca repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Samuel. Welcome to the world, little one." Samuel proved to be a good baby, sleeping reasonably well and nursing strongly. Rebecca recovered from the birth more quickly than expected, and within a few weeks, she was back to most of her regular activities, though now with a baby strapped to her back or napping in a basket nearby. Watching Yates with their son filled Rebecca with a joy she had never imagined possible. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, singing Samuel to sleep with old cowboy songs and talking to him constantly as if the baby could understand every word. And perhaps in some way he could, because Samuel always seemed to calm at the sound of his father's voice. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier and more complicated with a child, but also richer and more filled with laughter. Samuel grew quickly, becoming a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and everything. By his first birthday, he was walking, or more accurately, toddling everywhere at high speed, getting into everything and keeping Rebecca constantly busy. That same year, Yates received an offer from a cattle buyer in Prescott that promised to significantly improve their financial situation. He would need to drive a herd north, a journey that would take several weeks. It was a difficult decision, leaving Rebecca and Samuel alone, but the money would allow them to make improvements they had been dreaming about, including building a proper bunkhouse so they could hire help. "Go," Rebecca told him firmly when he hesitated. "We will be fine. I managed on my own before I met you, remember? And now I have Samuel to keep me company. We will be here when you get back." The drive was successful, and Yates returned 5 weeks later with more money than they had ever had at one time. They used it wisely, building the bunkhouse and hiring 2 ranch hands, brothers named Tom and William Carson, who proved to be hard workers and reliable men. With their help, Yates was able to expand the herd and take on more horses to train. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, and so did the Thompson family. When Samuel was 3, Rebecca became pregnant again, and this time delivered a daughter they named Emily Rose. Emily had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had her big brother wrapped around her tiny finger. 2 years after Emily came another son, Daniel Yates Thompson, who had his father's quiet nature and his mother's determination. And 3 years after that, their family was completed with the birth of twin girls, Sarah and Grace, who were identical in appearance but opposite in temperament. The house that had once seemed spacious for 2 people became crowded and noisy with 5 children, but it was a good kind of chaos, filled with laughter and love. Yates added rooms as they could afford it, and eventually the simple ranch house became a sprawling home that reflected the family that lived within it. Rebecca's scars faded somewhat over the years, though they never disappeared entirely. but she had long since stopped thinking about them as a source of shame. Her children never saw them as anything unusual, just part of what their mother looked like. And Yates still looked at her with the same love and admiration he had shown from the beginning, his eyes lighting up whenever she entered a room. As the children grew, Rebecca made sure they understood the values that had sustained her through her darkest times. She taught them to be kind to those who were different, to look beyond surface appearances to see the person beneath. She taught them that strength came not from never falling, but from getting back up every time you were knocked down. And she taught them that love, real love, saw past imperfections to cherish the whole person. Samuel grew into a tall, steady young man who shared his father's gift with horses. He took over much of the training work, developing a reputation throughout the territory for his skill. Emily became a teacher, opening a small school on the ranch for the children of neighboring families. Daniel followed his father's footsteps in ranching, with an eye for good cattle and a knack for business. And the twins, Sarah and Grace, were still finding their paths, but showed promise in everything they attempted. One evening in the spring of 1898, as Yates and Rebecca sat on the porch watching the sunset, their grandchildren playing in the yard, Samuel having recently married and had a son of his own, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 16 years had passed since that terrible winter when she had been left to die in the snow, abandoned by people who should have protected her. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not found you that day?" Yates asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Sometimes," Rebecca admitted. "Though not as often as I used to. That woman who was left in the snow, she seems like a different person now. Someone I used to be but am not anymore." "She was not different," Yates said, reaching over to take her hand. "She was just the same as you are now, just waiting for someone to see her clearly. I was lucky to be the one who found her, Rebecca. You saved my life just as surely as I saved yours. I was half alive before you came, just going through the motions. You made everything mean something." Rebecca squeezed his hand, this man who had looked at her scarred face and seen beauty, who had seen past what the fever had taken to recognize what it had revealed. "You told me I was perfect to you," she said softly. "Do you remember? That first day you brought me here, you said it when you thought I was asleep." "I remember," Yates said. "And I meant it then and I mean it now. You are perfect to me, Rebecca. Not despite your scars, not even because of them, but just because you are you. That has never changed." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the yard, their grandson laughed as Grace pushed him on the swing Yates had built years ago for their own children. Emily was due to visit tomorrow with her husband, and Daniel and his wife would join them for Sunday dinner. The house would be full again, noisy and chaotic and wonderful. Rebecca thought about the word perfect and how its meaning had changed for her over the years. She had once thought perfection meant having smooth skin and fitting in with society's expectations. But she had learned that true perfection was messier and more complicated than that. It was found in shared work and mutual respect, in laughter over breakfast and quiet conversations at the end of long days. It was in the way Yates still reached for her hand when they walked, in the way he still kissed her goodbye every morning even after 16 years of marriage. Perfect was not the absence of scars, but the presence of love that saw beyond them. Perfect was not a smooth path, but two people committed to walking a rough road together. Perfect was 5 healthy children and a growing number of grandchildren, a ranch that had prospered through hard work and dedication, and a partnership that had only grown stronger with time. "Thank you," Rebecca said to Yates, not for the first time and certainly not for the last. "For what?" he asked, though he was smiling because he knew, for finding me," she said. "For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me this life." "Thank you for saying yes," Yates replied. "For trusting me, for building this life with me, for being exactly who you are." As the sun finally slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca leaned against Yates's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the horses in the corral whinnied softly to each other. The wind carried the scent of sage and growing things, the smell of the high desert that had become home. She thought of that desperate, dying woman in the abandoned cabin, alone in the snow, convinced that her life was over. If she could speak to that woman now, she would tell her to hold on, that rescue was coming. She would tell her that the worst moment of her life was about to become the doorway to the best, that the man who would find her would see her not as broken or damaged, but as strong and worthy of love. She would tell her that she was perfect exactly as she was, and that soon she would meet someone who would help her see that truth for herself. But that woman was gone now, transformed not by loss but by love, not by what had been taken but by what had been freely given. In her place was Rebecca Thompson, wife and mother and grandmother, ranch woman and survivor, beloved and loving in equal measure. The scars remained, a permanent map of her past written on her skin, but they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, the chapter that had led her to Yates and to this life they had built together. And when she looked in the mirror now, she saw what Yates had always seen, not imperfection, but the beautiful complexity of a real life fully lived. As the evening deepened and the air grew cool, Yates stood and helped Rebecca to her feet. "Come on," he said with a grin. "I believe there is pie left from dinner, and I am not above splitting it with you before the grandchildren discover it tomorrow." Rebecca laughed and let him lead her inside, into the warm, lamp-lit house that held all of her dreams made real. Behind them, the door closed on another day in a life that had once seemed impossible, but had become more wonderful than anything she could have imagined. Years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to the Thompson family story. Samuel's horse breeding program became known throughout Arizona and beyond, with buyers coming from as far as California and Texas to purchase his stock. Emily's school grew, eventually moving from the ranch to a building in Quartzsite itself, though Rebecca noted with satisfaction that her daughter taught her students the same lessons about kindness and looking beyond appearances that she had learned. Daniel married a sensible woman named Catherine, who shared his passion for ranching, and together they took over more of the day-to-day operations, allowing Yates to finally slow down a bit. Not that he ever really retired. He was still up before dawn most mornings, still spending his days working with the animals and the land he loved. But now he could take afternoons off when he wanted, could spend more time with Rebecca and their growing collection of grandchildren. The twins, Sarah and Grace, both eventually married as well. Sarah wed a doctor and moved to Phoenix, where she became involved in charitable work helping the poor. Grace surprised everyone by becoming a journalist, writing articles about life in the territories for Eastern newspapers. She had inherited her mother's fierce independence and her father's steady courage, and she used both to forge her own unique path. As for Rebecca and Yates, they settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long and happy marriage. They still worked side by side, though now it was more often in the garden than with the cattle. They still talked for hours, sharing thoughts and memories, making plans for the future even as they savored the present. And they still loved each other with the fierce devotion that had marked their relationship from the beginning. On their 20th wedding anniversary in April of 1903, Yates surprised Rebecca with a gift. It was a photograph he had commissioned, a portrait of her taken by a traveling photographer. In the image, Rebecca stood in front of their house, her hand resting on the porch railing, her face turned slightly to the side so the light caught her features clearly. The scars were visible in the photograph, undeniable and permanent. But so was everything else. The strength in her posture, the kindness in her eyes, the small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. It was not a picture of a scarred woman. It was a picture of Rebecca Thompson, complete and whole and beautiful. "I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you," Yates said as Rebecca studied the photograph. "I wanted you to have proof that you are not defined by what happened to you, but by who you chose to become afterward." Rebecca carefully framed the photograph and hung it in their bedroom, where she could see it every morning when she woke. And on the difficult days, when old insecurities resurfaced, or when she caught someone staring at her scars with too much curiosity, she would look at that image and remember the truth. She was Rebecca Thompson, beloved wife and mother, successful rancher and survivor. The scars were part of her story, but they were not the whole story. The early years of the new century brought changes to Arizona and to the Thompson Ranch. The territory was moving toward statehood, and with it came new opportunities and new challenges. The old Wild West was fading, replaced by a more settled and civilized society. Towns grew larger, railroads spread across the land, and the days of open range and cattle drives were coming to an end. But some things remained constant. The high desert still stretched away in all directions, beautiful and harsh and honest. The work of ranching still required strength and dedication, and a willingness to face whatever challenges came. And the love between Rebecca and Yates still burned bright, a fire that had been kindled in crisis but had been carefully tended and fed until it became something that could withstand anything. In the summer of 1907, Martha, Rebecca's stepmother, died. Rebecca learned of it from a letter sent by a lawyer in Quartzsite, informing her that Martha had left her a small inheritance, perhaps as a final acknowledgement of the wrong she had done all those years ago. Rebecca accepted the money without bitterness, using it to establish a fund that would help others who faced illness or hardship, so that no one else would have to experience what she had endured. She also made a point of visiting Martha's grave, standing in the Quartzsite cemetery with Yates beside her. She felt no triumph at outliving the woman who had cast her out, only a kind of sad pity for someone who had been so afraid of difference and disease that she had sent a young woman to die rather than show mercy. "I forgive you," Rebecca said quietly to the grave. "Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I will not let what you did define the rest of my life. I am happy, Martha. I have a husband who loves me, children who make me proud, and a life filled with purpose and joy. You tried to take everything from me, but instead you set me free. So I forgive you and I let you go." As they walked back to the wagon, Yates put his arm around Rebecca's waist. "You are a better person than I am," he said. "I do not know if I could be that generous." "I am not being generous," Rebecca said. "I am being selfish. Holding on to anger and bitterness would only hurt me, not her. She is gone, and I am still here, still living and loving and building a life. Forgiveness is just another way of choosing happiness." The years rolled on, bringing both joys and sorrows as all lives must. They lost friends to illness and accident, watched as the world changed in ways both exciting and troubling. But through it all, the Thompson family remained strong, bound together by ties of love and mutual respect. Rebecca's children gave her more grandchildren, and those grandchildren eventually began having children of their own, so that by 1915, Rebecca and Yates found themselves great-grandparents. The ranch that had once seemed so isolated was now the center of a sprawling family network, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren visiting regularly, filling the house with noise and laughter and life. On a warm evening in October of that year, the entire family gathered at the ranch to celebrate Rebecca's 55th birthday. The house overflowed with people, 3 generations of Thompsons talking and laughing and sharing stories. Tables had been set up outside under the trees, laden with food that Rebecca's daughters and daughters-in-law had prepared. Children ran through the yard, their shouts of joy echoing across the property. As Rebecca looked around at the celebration, at all of these people who existed because she had survived that terrible winter so many years ago, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Every one of these lives, every one of these stories, had been made possible because Yates Thompson had ridden up to an abandoned cabin and refused to leave a dying woman behind. Yates found her standing alone for a moment, taking it all in. He was 60 now, his dark hair gone gray and his face lined by years of sun and wind, but his eyes were still the same, still looking at her with that mixture of love and admiration that had never faded. "Happy birthday," he said, pulling her close. "Thank you," Rebecca said, leaning into his embrace, "for this, for all of it, for giving me a life worth celebrating." "You gave me the same," Yates said. "More than the same, you gave me everything that matters." That night, after the guests had gone home or been settled into beds throughout the house and bunkhouse, Rebecca and Yates lay together in their room, listening to the sounds of their family sleeping around them. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Rebecca asked softly. "When you found me in the cabin, I said a lot of things," Yates replied, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on her arm. "Which one do you mean?" "You said you are going to be all right," Rebecca said. "And you were correct, but it was more than just surviving the cold and hunger. You made me believe that I could be all right, that I could have a good life even with these scars, even after everything that had happened." "You did that yourself," Yates said. "I just saw what was already there." "We did it together," Rebecca corrected. "That is what marriage is it not? 2 people helping each other become the best versions of themselves, seeing each other clearly and loving what they see." "That is exactly what it is," Yates agreed. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had built over more than 3 decades together. Outside, the high desert stretched away under a canopy of stars, the same land that had witnessed their beginning and would witness however many years they had left. Time moved forward, as it always does. Yates and Rebecca continued to age, their bodies growing slower and more frail, but their connection only deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1923, with a party even larger than Rebecca's birthday celebration had been. By then, they had 7 grandchildren married with families of their own, and the number of great-grandchildren had grown too large to easily count. Samuel had taken over as the primary manager of the ranch, though he still consulted with his father on major decisions. The property had expanded significantly over the years, now covering several thousand acres and running several hundred head of cattle. It was a far cry from the small operation Yates had started with, but it had grown organically, carefully, in ways that honored the land and the animals. As Rebecca and Yates moved into their 70s, they finally stepped fully back from the work of the ranch, content to spend their days in quieter pursuits. They read together, sitting side by side on the porch. They worked in the garden, though now with grandchildren doing the heavier digging. They told stories to great-grandchildren who gathered around them, eager to hear about the old days, about how the ranch was built, about how their great-grandmother and great-grandfather met. Rebecca always told the truth about her scars, about the fever and the abandonment. She did not sugarcoat what had happened or pretend it had been less painful than it was. But she also emphasized the lesson she had learned, the truth that Yates had taught her. That being different was not the same as being less, that scars told stories of survival, and that real love saw the whole person, not just the surface. Remember, she would tell the children, it is not what happens to you that defines you. It is how you respond and who you choose to become afterward. I could have let bitterness and anger consume me. Instead, I chose to accept help when it was offered, to build a new life, to love and be loved. That is always a choice, even when it does not feel like it. In the spring of 1928, as Arizona prepared to celebrate its 16th year of statehood, Yates fell ill. It started as a simple cold but quickly developed into pneumonia. Despite the best efforts of doctors and the devoted care of his family, his body, weakened by 74 years of hard living, could not fight off the infection. Rebecca never left his side during those final days. She held his hand, talked to him when he was lucid enough to respond, and simply sat with him when he was not. Their children and grandchildren came to say goodbye, filling the house with quiet grief and whispered memories. On a warm afternoon in late April, with Rebecca sitting beside his bed and their children gathered around, Yates took his last breath. His passing was peaceful, his hand still clasped in Rebecca's, his face relaxed and calm. The grief that followed was profound but not bitter. Yates had lived a long, full life, had been loved and had loved deeply in return. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, ranchers and townspeople, friends and family, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had been respected and admired throughout the territory. As Rebecca stood beside the grave where they had laid Yates to rest on a hill overlooking the ranch, she thought about the journey they had traveled together. 46 years from that moment in the snow to this moment in the sunshine, 46 years of partnership and love, of challenges faced and overcome, of a life built together from nothing. "Thank you," she whispered to the fresh earth. "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for every single day we had together. I will miss you until we meet again, but I will not waste the time I have left. I will live fully, the way you taught me to, and I will make sure our story continues through our children and their children. You will never be forgotten, my love. Never." Rebecca lived for 5 more years after Yates's death. They were good years, though tinged with the sadness of his absence. She remained active and engaged with the ranch and the family, serving as matriarch and advisor, storyteller and keeper of history. She watched more great-grandchildren born, saw her grandchildren take their places as leaders of the family and the ranch. She spent her time writing down the family history, wanting to preserve the stories for future generations who would never know Yates or the early days of the ranch. She wrote about her childhood, about the fever, about that terrible winter and the cowboy who had saved her life. She wrote about building the ranch, about raising their children, about the love that had sustained them through everything. On a quiet morning in September of 1933, Rebecca died peacefully in her sleep. She was 73 years old, and she had lived to see her family grow to include 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and 37 great-grandchildren, with more on the way. She had lived to see the ranch prosper and grow into one of the most successful operations in the region. She had lived long enough to know that her story, hers and Yates's, would continue long after she was gone. They buried her beside Yates on that same hill, under a shared headstone that read simply, Yates Thompson, 1856 to 1928, and Rebecca Brandt Thompson, 1860 to 1933, partners in life and love. forever together. The ranch continued under Samuel's management and eventually passed to his children and grandchildren. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the core of it remained the same, the rooms that Yates had built still at the heart of the structure. The land continued to produce, supporting generation after generation of Thompsons who worked it with the same dedication and love that their ancestors had shown. And always, in every generation, someone would tell the story of Rebecca and Yates, of the woman who was left in the snow for being different and the cowboy who had said she was perfect to him. They told it to remind themselves of where they came from, of the strength and courage that ran in their blood. They told it to teach their children about real love, the kind that saw past scars and imperfections to cherish the whole person. And they told it because it was true, and because some stories are too important to ever be forgotten. The abandoned cabin where Yates had found Rebecca eventually collapsed, returning to the earth from which it had been built. But the spot was marked with a small monument, placed there by Samuel and his siblings, a stone cairn that told anyone who might pass by. Here, in the winter of 1882, our mother Rebecca Brandt was found by our father Yates Thompson. From this place of despair came a love that built a family, a ranch, and a legacy that endures. High above the ranch, on the rocky outcrop where Yates had proposed to Rebecca all those years ago, the view remained unchanged. The land still stretched away in layers of color and light, the mountains still rose against the horizon, and the sky still arched overhead in endless blue. The world had changed in countless ways, but this place, this land that Rebecca and Yates had loved, remained constant, a reminder that some things endure beyond time and circumstance. And on warm evenings when the light was just right, when the sunset painted the world in gold and crimson, people said you could sometimes see two figures standing on that outcrop, hand in hand, looking out over the land they had built together. Just a trick of the light, perhaps, or shadows cast by the rocks. But those who believed in love that transcends death liked to think it was Rebecca and Yates, still together, still watching over the family and the ranch that had been their life's work. Whether ghost or shadow, memory or imagination, it did not really matter. What mattered was the truth the story carried, the lesson it taught. That love, real love, sees beyond scars and imperfections to cherish the whole person. That being different is not the same as being less. That the worst moments of our lives can become doorways to the best. And that sometimes, when everything seems lost, rescue comes in the form of someone who looks at you and says, with absolute conviction, "You are perfect to me." That was the legacy Rebecca and Yates left behind, more valuable than land or cattle or money. They left a family built on love and acceptance, a tradition of seeing people clearly and cherishing what you see, and a story that would be told and retold for generations, inspiring others to look past surfaces to find the beauty that lies beneath. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for than to be remembered that way? To know that their love had mattered, that their story had meaning, that they had left the world a little better than they found it. Rebecca and Yates had done all of that and more. They had taken a moment of cruelty and abandonment and transformed it into a lifetime of love and partnership. They had proven that scars do not diminish beauty, but rather reveal the strength required to survive. And they had shown that sometimes the most perfect love stories begin in the most imperfect circumstances, with two people who choose to see the best in each other and build a life on that foundation. Their story lived on, passed down through the generations, a reminder and a promise. That love endures, that kindness matters, and that every person, no matter how scarred or different, deserves to hear someone say, "You are perfect to me."